The story is called What, Me Worry? It's about a man and a house. Note, I have made a simple word substitution in this tale in order to make it more palatable to innocent, decent listeners. I'm not going to go into unnecessary detail on this other than to say that it allows me to discuss a sequence of events that caused me to end up chitting in the woods. It all started when I was 8 years old and didn't do my chores. All they did was confine me to the yard. It wasn't enough. There's lots to do in the yard. The swing set was back there. I could do balancing tricks on the white picket fence without actually, technically, violating the parental treaty. I could have both feet on the ground outside the slats and still retain inside residence with one hand over the top, no violation. This is not a screed in favor of corporal punishment. I'm not saying that that is even what would have worked. I'm just saying a simple, obviously temporary ban on neighborhood travel was not enough to prevent future transgressions or train me in the proper procedures of childhood impulse regulation. What they should have had me doing was receiving instruction on fence fabrication. There should have been supervision and judgment on my fence construction work done by me on my own fence, a fence which confined me to my own yard with knowledge and pride in support of my own righteous incarceration. You can give a man a fence, or you can teach him how to fence. That's right. I'm offering one of those rampant permissivity in the 1950s arguments that used to be so common, and to me are obviously so right. Certain parties, i.e. kids of hard-working post-war families, themselves with Depression-era parents, didn't want their kids to suffer pre-war or wartime inconvenience, and so they let them off easy and didn't teach them to do a damn thing about maintaining a happy, productive life. Simple as that. I've never heard a convincing refutation of that exact thesis. So, whatever went wrong with the house or car, or at the job, or even in the town, was in my youthful world taken care of by unseen forces. Moms and dads who already knew what to do, and we kids just aimed for the 3 R's and college, and as long as we handled that, we were free to live like cherubs flying adorably in the clouds over the soap opera of life in Renaissance paintings, but subject to puzzled and agitated lockdowns when, beyond all understanding, we didn't behave. How were we supposed to know? There was no privation-induced discipline to force us to learn and follow the rules. Now, in fairness, it is possible my transgression in that particular instance was a little more severe than just not doing my chores. I had, around that time, tried to swim the river, and when I realized I wasn't going to make it, I paddled to a private dock which had pontoon moorings well out into the water. And either out of frustration or possibly sheer imagination, once I was aboard the planks, I ran back to shore on the lined-up bouncing decks of the boats in their V-shaped moorings, banging and rocking and yelling the whole way, whence I departed swiftly and silently along the shore. I can still feel the joy of it today. Alas, I was seen, reported, and ID, thus the detention. So maybe it wasn't just the chores. The principle is the same, though. Which brings us to my 1830s upstate New York farmhouse in the country, age 20 and dutifully in college for me. Because, of course, I had to have a farmhouse. If you skip all the stages of American civilizational development back to feudal times, crossing the ocean in miniature ships, chopping down trees and clearing land, getting yourself a car to fix up, milking cows, fighting in wars in which you had to repair tanks and planes while under fire, etc., not to mention how your grandparents had hard scrabbled through the Depression. If you missed all that, or at least accounts of it, then you're going to try to reconstitute some of it. In my case, buying an old farmhouse that is barely livable. And now, what are you going to do when your well runs dry? And your well is going to run dry. That alone you should have been told. If you live in an old country house, your well is going to run dry. And if you live in an old country house so you can try to learn what your parents and grandparents have never told you about, which I did, then your well is still going to go dry. A lot of people don't know this. And when it happens, you don't even realize the implications of it at first. You first think of the inconvenience. No water for the garden, since that's where you were when the well went out. Watering the tomatoes in the late evening dusk. No water to drink and wash dishes. Then you realize the toilet doesn't work. Toilets are a non-trivial accommodation. The Romans invented them and killed themselves with the required lead pipes, but I expect they still thought it was well worth it. If you live in the country and your toilet goes out, you are up against the far past. You are in the woods with the bears. My well turned out to be 300 feet deep. I was on the top of a hill overlooking a lake, a big blue lake filled with an ocean of water, but it was a long way down to the water table. Through many hundreds of millions of years of Paleozoically interesting striated Dead Sea sediment. And the pathologically grim guy from the well company said the replacement well might have to be 400 feet. Thank goodness there even was such a guy available to a person with my slender means, someone who had received proper training and discipline in some subject. But there was no guarantee that even the 400-footer would work. Plus the months until they could start digging. And I had already been to the woods on several occasions, once when it was raining. Now, I'm not saying that every boy should be trained to do every little thing, even if that were possible. In fact, there was a famous economist named Ricardo who attributed all human progress to our ability to specialize and trade our differing skills for value. I'm not saying I should have been able to fix that well myself. I'm just saying I should have been endowed with more than an ability to figure out who to call. I was lucky that the pipe from the lake to a small inland berg uphill from the lake was buried along my remote gravel road. Don't say there is no providence before you've been put to the test. There are abandoned houses all over the eastern U.S. in the most lovely remote locations. Why? The well dried up and nothing to connect to. So I lucked out on that. I had never concerned myself with the honest folk who populated that inland burg on the far end of my providential pipe. But I did now appreciate their engineering prowess in providing themselves with water to drink, bathe, and run their toilets. The time had come to piggyback on all of that. All I had to do was run a tubular section from my basement down a short, steep, muddy hill and attach. Piece of cake. That is, permits to the town first, and then a piece of cake. Who even knew I lived in a town? Maybe it was a township, a reference to the ocean-like body of water so nearby, yet so far away. Whatever, there was a post office-like office at the intersection of Main and Elm, and an ancient, world-weary, big-bosomed lady clerk in winged, cat-eyed spectacles who seemed to bear me no ill will. I'll bet she could have told me my well would run dry. I hired a backhoe guy who had a narrow, whirling, grinding, many-toothed flywheel sort of attachment on his rig for gouging the trench. He began the whirling amidst much sparks and dust, and immediately hit something unpierceable and flipped over. He danced away from the wreck like it happened all the time. And now his rig was stuck sideways in the mud on my hill, and we had to call in a really big backhoe to haul it out. But that backhoe also mired down and flipped over, and so I had two big yellow piles of hydraulically flailing girders intertwined on my lawn like two yellow dinosaurs who had been hit by a meteor while mating. Thus, with winter coming on, and I was still chitting in the woods. What I should have done was build an emergency backup plywood outhouse. I had the skills for that. Those tend to be pretty rough-hewn. We had them in Tennessee. I understood them completely. This was before the days of porta-johns. One must never underestimate the value of progress. Of course, if a porta-john had been available, I probably would have simply installed it in the closet where the toilet was and made the place usable but unlivable. Unsaleable, certainly. Not to mention, totally unlivable, should any possible girlfriends have ever ventured into the place. Although I can think of multiple possible deterrences such mythical beings would have encountered long before they got to the second floor John. Probably just the Bates Motel location of the place. There's a lovely avian in the Australo-Pacific called a bowerbird. The male decorates an artfully constructed house of twigs with bits of bright-colored metal and flowers to attract a female. I've never heard anything about a side nest containing running water facilities in that setup. Maybe they don't need that. Most likely down there, those birds just chit in the woods and think nothing of it. In any case, maybe only because of the 4 dead cars in the driveway or my granddad's old mildewed horsehair couch in the yard, my setup was never tested by outside parties who might be interested in brightly colored decorations on a prospective dwelling with a mate. One day in February, when there was a chance of an early unfreeze, a guy came out to figure out a way to pull out the backhoes. While we were discussing it, a look came on his face and he asked if he could use the bathroom. As his plight became apparent, I had to nod towards the woodlot. You might be surprised at the etiquette of that particular practice. Being near or knowledgeable about an offered woods chitting. Yet, it's totally automatic, no training required. You look down so as not to be sure of even the exact location the person went. The whole project is based on mutual deep woods respect and empathy going way back. You don't wait. You occupy yourself with some minor task like weeding a flower bed. And when the guy reappears, you go on as if no time had passed. There are no questions. Did you find a spot okay? Did you squat up on a log? Did you use a leaf? Was there any kind of balance problem? Did you make sure you cleared your shoes? Are you sure you were unobserved, even by an innocent animal like a squirrel or badger? Will this ever be mentioned again to anyone? Anyway, the big backhoe was eventually, 8 months, lifted out by a big red truck crane that never even left the road below. That crane could have lifted Doolittle's B-25s off the Hornet over the heaving Pacific with a single flick of its neck and sent them on their way like baby birds released from the nest. That multi-flagged wide-load machine stopped traffic up on the main road for half a day just getting on location. They never would have done it except they wanted their backhoes back. And then the big backhoe dragged out the little backhoe as originally planned. A different path for the trench was chosen, the pipe was laid, and the water flowed. This concludes part 1. Part 2 actually precedes part 1, and it is the linchpin in my original permissive child-rearing thesis. I just didn't realize that until recently. Part 2 answers the question, why did the well run dry? Oh, it was going to run dry, that's established, but why then? What was the proximate reason? There doesn't have to be a known proximate reason, but there often is, even if it's not the real one. As I said before, there will come a day when the well goes dry. But you can put that day off with proper planning and training. Who knows? Perhaps until you've sold the place and moved on. Here it is, the pilot light. The pilot light. That's right. Nobody told me you have to service a furnace. I knew you had to get heating oil delivered, found that out the hard way, and I figured out how to relight the pilot light. Nobody has ever claimed I don't have potential. I read the little green letters on the side of the furnace, followed the 6 intricate steps, and risked death by explosion with a long match while lying on the basement floor, but I learned it. The furnace was in the corner of the basement, down the 150-year-old worn wooden stairs. Where I grew up in Tennessee, the TVA power came in on a wire to a box above the porch. And if it went out, there was an easy switch. You just clicked that off and then clicked it back on. I knew all about that. But nobody told me about what I had to do with an oil furnace. Well, if you don't have the furnace serviced, if you don't get it serviced, then after a few years, the carbon builds up and the pilot light goes out. That usually happens in the dead of winter when you're down south fishing in the Everglades. And so there is enough time before you get back so that the water gushing from the frozen pipe in the kitchen ceiling actually fills up the entire basement, such that when you open the cellar door, a noticeably cresting wave rolls out over your shoes. A guy had to come in a green rubber suit with lead boots and walked down the aforementioned 150-year-old smooth steps into the black water and shut off the power. A truck with a pump and a foot-wide flexible accordion hose purred for 3 days for a total draining. And, incredibly, the pilot lit. That old furnace equipment was durably made, which is, I guess, why we won the war my parents never told me about, which allowed me to be raised in permissive, ignorant, thoughtless, incompetent freedom, and failed to teach me the importance of simple preventive maintenance. That was probably not their fault. I most likely would have done the same. Human nature. They did refer me to that proverbial tale where the horse's shoe is lost for lack of a nail, and then the rider, and then the battle, the war, the continent, the planet, all of it. I knew all that in the abstract. I just didn't know how to apply it to a given furnace in a given basement. Anyway, later, I realized that big leak is when the whole Devonian floodplain aquifer at the level of my 300-foot deep well was weakened and drained into a small puddle. That's what dried up my well. On delay, I was just thoughtlessly living off the remaining rivulets into the summer after the big winter drain. That's what caused those big yellow backhoes to be turned over on my hill all winter, and why I had to chit in the woods for all those months. Here endeth Part 2.